So hopefully I can see Paul is online and he's able to say hello.
I am, yes, yeah. Hello, welcome everybody, and hello actually from Ireland, because although I cover the UK, I actually live in Ireland, so sort of
right.
Been stuck here for the last year or so. So welcome,
as we all have.
Everybody.
Thank you for joining us today, Paul. So I believe you're going to start off with a bit of an overview, and then we'll get into the Q&A session. Is that correct?
That was the intention. I was just really going to do a little bit of a recap on kind of how the employability skills kind of suite of qualifications, and it's important to kind of think of it as a whole kind of series of sort of overlapping and interlinking
Yes.
units, and kind of within there a whole string of sort of little sort of stop-off points that allow achievements of varying types to be sort of recognised. It's been around in sort of different guises for about actually nearly 14 years now, actually, because it was sort of about 2007 it was sort of we initially sort of worked on the previous version of it, so it's been around for a while in it, but its last sort of major revamp was kind of 5-6 years ago. But the main idea behind it was always about trying to sort of recognise different aspects of employability skills, and obviously always about trying to recognise kind of achievement at different levels, stages, different sizes of program, and to allow those sort of achievements to be recognised in quite a flexible way. Because the other thing that's obviously critical to it was the idea that we wouldn't be setting kind of exams in employability. We would be sort of allowing learners to build a portfolio of evidence that demonstrates their capabilities, and allow those to be sort of either developed in a classroom type environment, but equally could be generated through kind of real life examples of where those skills have been demonstrated. So that principle kind of runs right through the whole suite. We've got obviously the various different aspects of coverage there, in the sense of kind of things that are sort of orientated towards getting a job, the sort of a range of units that support a kind of, I guess, intended more to support kind of in work, but then also kind of some sort of underlying or kind of related skills. So there are things like some personal and social type skills, kind of things like time management and those sorts of things that may be intrinsic to work but might not be directly relevant to a particular job role. And then there are also one of the other strands that sits within this suite, kind of a little bit self-contained and a little bit semi-detached from the rest of the series, are what we call a series of sort of vocational tasters. And those are sort of slightly separate qualifications, but they form part of this suite. But they would allow, for example, if somebody is interested in sort of just finding out more about working in, say, the hospitality sector, that they would have an opportunity to develop some initial sort of experience, exposure to that sector, and allow that to be recognised. We'd always be at pains to say that having done those vocational tasters doesn't make you qualified to work in that sector. I think doing a plumbing unit from this doesn't make you a plumber, but nevertheless it's an opportunity of demonstrating a little bit of interest in that area. So those sit there as well as part of this series. But what we then also have is the ability to kind of mix and match, because one of the other things we were keen to do when we developed this series was that there wouldn't be sort of mandatory units that it would have to be taken. It was simply almost like a box of units that you would dip into and choose depending on the sort of program that's being operated, but also the local circumstances, the capabilities of the individual may fit. That said, I know in reality often what will tend to happen is providers will sort of pull together a kind of a coherent program, and we'll kind of we'll do that sort of that process of picking from the sort of range of units in here and putting together a coherent program that kind of works in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And within that there are obviously quite other important things like kind of different sizes of qualification that can be taken into account, different levels. The qualification operates across 4 levels, obviously using the regulated qualification framework, the framework that most of the UK uses around obviously, so sort of spans entry 2, entry 3, level 1 and level 2 of that framework in terms of its comparability and its kind of level of demand. So that's kind of the model. When we developed this, we were keen to provide some support with teaching and learning resources, so kind of again formally separate from the qualification, but never much part of the wider employability offer is a range of resources that are available through the Smart Screen portal. And I gather certainly from conversations with Tony that you would have access to that as a matter of course, and often in other settings sometimes we charge separately for those, but those are obviously available. They're not intended to sort of substitute for teaching and learning, and in a way part of the whole ethos behind this suite was allowing flexibility about where evidence could come from, but they're there obviously to help in terms of providing some activities that could help with acquiring some of these capabilities and some of these skills, but also potentially providing a little bit of a template that could help inform that process of gathering evidence. It's never quite as straightforward as work your way through the Smart Screen and you'll have evidence that meets all of the criteria, because it's only as good as the activities that are actually being done. But nevertheless, they're there to sort of help inform that process and to help provide some relevant activities. Also, I guess from an assessor teacher point of view, to provide a little bit of insight into what the expectations ultimately are in terms of the qualifications themselves. So that's the kind of a little bit of a sort of a whistle stop. There are some, obviously we can kind of delve into the kind of questions in a moment, but probably also worth just quickly mentioning that there are obviously a number of documents that anyone working with this qualification would kind of need to be familiar with. And because obviously there is so many different units within this, what we've tried to do, rather than have one enormous handbook that covered everything, was split it into several volumes. So what you basically have is a handbook that sort of explains how the suite works and sets out the sort of various, lists all of the units and the sizes of qualifications and the sort of rules of combination that apply to each of those qualifications. But what we then have is a separate document covering each level, and what that then does is provide the actual detailed content of each unit, including obviously the formal learning outcomes and assessment criteria that need to be met, but also some guidance and some suggestions as to how each of those can be met. So it's important to look at the two in tandem with one another. There is then obviously a third type of document, and what we call a logbook, which is obviously a document. It's a paper document, but nevertheless, obviously it's there as a vehicle for recording where evidence has been gathered, and obviously you'd only use the units that you're intending to cover and deliver from that, but those documents. But obviously it provides a mechanism for recording where that evidence is, so it can be assessed. So probably worth us delving into questions. Probably worth saying just quickly to preempt, and because as I said, there's a question already in the chat box around the materials from Smart Screen. As I understand it, we've given kind of access to those to everybody as a matter of course, so you will have kind of sight of those. I mean, they won't, and quite deliberately, they won't cover every unit, because what we wanted to do was provide some flexibility, but what they will certainly do is help in terms of framing some possible activities and providing some insight into what might help in terms of kind of things that may help to generate or to cover the learning required, but also to generate the sort of activities that could potentially provide evidence for assessment purposes. So are there any more questions coming through in the WhatsApp? Just posing as a question.
Yeah, Paul, there's a question on what would happen if a learner left halfway through the course. My own view is they're flexible enough to actually probably, even if there's one unit, they could potentially be credentialed for one unit. What's your take on that, Paul?
That's probably quite an important point, because one of the things that we tried to do when we built this suite of qualifications was try to create as many step on and step off points as we could. So the smallest sort of qualification size is actually 2 credits in terms of I mean, it's important to think, obviously the whole thing is built around the notion of credit-based achievement. So each unit has a what we term a credit value attached to it, and that represents, each credit is notionally 10 hours worth of learning time. So the smallest qualification size is 2 credits, so effectively one unit. So even if your intention up front was that they might have been working towards one of the larger qualifications, what you may well be able to do if they do if the learner does leave partway through is, depending on what units they've got completed, you may well be able to get those recognised into as a qualification. And also, again, just to sort of follow on from that point, I guess the other point is that those achievements can always be added to later on. So what you could have is a learner who's on programme, achieves some units, gets an award-sized qualification for those, may go away again or may come back a year or 2 later, could pick up from where they left off, do some more units, and then potentially with the units they've already got, have enough credit for a larger sized qualification. So there is that sort of that ability to kind of step on and step off all the way through.
This is a question about lesson plans. I think you've addressed that in respect to the resources which we've made available on those units, and I do give good guidance and a template really for developing materials and activities. There are schemes of work, there's lesson plans available, there's activities for candidates. So I do, for those people who are asking for resources, please look at the portal that's there, log in there, and you're able to download those materials. One thing, Paul, is that, where people are developing their own materials, one of the questions that have been asked is, how confident are they about meeting the outcomes? Is there enough evidence for people to say, yes, that this person's achieved that, that outcome, that level of competence? What's your thoughts or experience around that kind of anxiety? Is there sufficient enough evidence?
I mean, a lot of that comes, if I'm honest, from experience, in the sense that if you've got a good sense of not just that particular unit, but a good sense generally of portfolio building, in the sense of what the evidence requirements are. We're quite careful about saying with this suite that there isn't one single right way of presenting evidence, in the sense that it can come from, and particularly there will be a lot of activities here where actually, to be honest, the best way of evidencing something is the assessor having seen it happen. And if the assessor can sign to say that they've seen something happen, then actually that is usually an acceptable form of evidence. There will be other instances where there is a kind of, if you like, a physical product of the evidence, in the sense that if the unit involves building a CV, the fact the learner has produced a CV is evidence of them having met those criteria. But there'll be lots of other instances where what we're looking for is more behavioural, or it may be kind of demonstrated through a conversation rather than necessarily through sort of something that exists in writing. And that's where observation, and that can often be about confidence, in the sense of having some confidence that coming through. One of the things that is important always about portfolio assessment is the need to have some internal standardization. So each assessor shouldn't be left to their own devices. You will always have a process of internal standardization, a process of internal quality assurance, or IV as we sometimes refer to it, where you bring together kind of all assessors, and you'll perhaps compare notes about your approaches, the different forms of evidence that you would or wouldn't accept. And obviously ultimately in turn we will have an external quality assurance process, an external verifier, who will obviously in turn look at that in as well, in terms of making sure that there is some consistency in terms of the decision making. But it's always about applying the standard in a consistent way, rather than necessarily there being a single right way to evidence something. So it will sometimes always rely on you having a little bit of ability to sort of look carefully at the assessment criteria. Most of the criteria for this qualification, you're only normally having to show one example of that having been met. So as long as there is something that meets what's set out in that assessment criterion. And this is also where the unit pack is quite important, because what it will often do is provide some examples of, not an exhaustive list, but some examples of the sorts of activities that would meet. So again, that can be used to help have that level of confidence as an assessor that what's there is good enough. Often there can sometimes be a little bit of a mismatch, but sometimes a little bit of a sense that sometimes your own standards might be higher than the standards of the qualification, in the sense that you might have your own view of what looks like good practice, but actually that might be asking for more than formally what the qualification is asking for. Equally, it could be the other way around, in the sense that you might be undershooting in terms of what the expectations are, and that's where it's important to look carefully at the unit pack, and particularly to understand that actually there are expectations. There will, if there is a need to see something more than once, normally it would be stated in the unit pack, as long as using a term. Usually it's referred to as a range statement if there's a need for more than one example or a breadth of different ways in which that could be met. But normally, if it's asking for evidence that learners have done X or Y, normally, as long as you've either seen or they've produced at least one example of that, then that will be sufficient.
Paul, there's just a couple of things. I'll try to summarise some of the questions or the themes. One of them was around language, in particular Arabic. I think you and I had a discussion already about, what is fit for purpose. How do people express themselves in Arabic? Is that accessible? And the other one is coming up is about online learning, and I think you received a question there already about, what's the evidence? How does that, in your experience, how does that work in the UK, particularly considering the COVID-19 challenges that we've had?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have had to do a lot of quite quick thinking around different ways in which evidence, and again, I suppose what on a lot of remote and online learning has forced people to think about is activities that might happen remotely. I mean, not necessarily directly relevant to this, but what we have had quite a lot with some of our English language qualifications is the people moving towards the speaking and listening activities being done remotely rather than face to face. So they'll be using Teams or Zoom or similar to be carrying those out rather than doing them in a face-to-face environment. And I guess the same principle can apply to this, in the sense that the evidence doesn't, none of the evidence generated through these qualifications has to be done in a formal sort of exam type environment. But what you do need to have is confidence that whatever it is taking place or being produced is that learner's own work, and that might be easy enough to establish if they're on a Teams call with you and you see them show you something or do something. Then clearly you can be as confident as would be reasonable that is their own work, and it is truly them doing that. You might need them on camera to be absolutely sure about that, but nevertheless, you can be reasonably confident about that, and that will happen. I think it's also about saying that because this is portfolio assessment, there isn't necessarily one single right way of producing evidence, and there might be what you've been used to doing in a face-to-face environment might not be as easy to replicate remotely, but there might be another way of which you could see something happen. What I have seen is sometimes either people sharing files, but also actually just taking screenshots, or even actually filming little video clips of things taking place as well, and that's potentially could lend itself to those activities. There is a little bit of a tendency, I guess, and we're all guilty of this a little bit as teachers and tutors and educators, of wanting everything written up, whereas sometimes actually if there's a video of something, then actually that's providing you with a with evidence of what you want to see, and if it's there, it's there to be, somebody else can obviously verify that as having happened, and so that can often be used as an activity as well.
Okay, and what about the language thing, Paul, in respects
the language one's interesting.
Yeah.
The language one's interesting. I mean, it is slightly complicated because this is obviously an England regulated qualification, a UK regulated qualification. So there are broad expectations that assessment should take place through the medium of English. Having said that, obviously, I think we're very conscious, and certainly from my recent conversations with Tony, I think this is quite important, but obviously we're recognising that for many of the learners taking this qualification, this may not be their first language. And equally, it's also quite important to obviously bear in mind that we're not assessing their English, although the assessment is taking place through the medium of English, we're not assessing their English language capability. So you're not necessarily, if their spelling, grammar, punctuation isn't 100% accurate, that's not an issue as far as this qualification is concerned. The only issue is where it might impede their ability to actually produce something that's fit for its intended purpose. So, for example, if they're having to produce a job application, or if they're having to provide a letter or provide something that's part of the evidence, then there is a sort of sense that should be, and you're not necessarily looking for 100% accuracy, but it should be fit broadly for its intended purpose. So there is a little bit of care needed there. I guess the assessment can take place. I mean, and there may well be lots of instances. We were talking about the examples of maybe some of the units where actually what you're looking for is visual or demonstrative rather than necessarily written product evidence, and their language may be less of a concern in any event. If say the assessment criterion is to wash a car adequately, then actually language in itself doesn't necessarily come into it in quite the same way. So there may not need to be a demonstrative, but certainly any formal physical product evidence, the expectation is that would be in English.
Thank you for that, Paul. There was a question about trainers and what would be like sort of the minimum requirements for a trainer to be approved. I know my understanding is that we're looking for obviously occupational competence in that field, like soft skills training. What's your thoughts on that in respect to the UK?
It's generally, I mean, employability is a tricky one, because actually most there's an argument if you're in well, we're either all incompetent or all competent, if you like, in the sense that there are it's not like a particular sectoral role where there's clearly professional qualifications and professional experience in that sector. I guess the crucial thing here is two things. One, in terms of that ability to understand the assessment process, in the sense of understanding that process of evidence gathering and building. So there is sort of a broad generic kind of familiarity with that process that's obviously important here. But also, I guess, I think it's quite a good example Tony gave of that ability around that soft skills development, or whatever terminology we might apply to that. So there is that sort of that sense and that ability to empathize and that ability to appreciate some of those roles, some of what employers might be looking for, some of those skills. So it is really about the ability to understand the assessment criteria. I guess we tend to use the parlance occupational competence because that tends to be what we would use within the vocational and technical kind of arena. So it's sort of it kind of is sort of used as a thing, but it's not, in a way, there isn't a sort of some one single thing that makes you a qualified employability assessor, in the sense that there are a range of experiences that could be relevant. But it is something around obviously understanding that process, and obviously having worked within this arena of supporting learners, or supporting learners in some way around their own personal skills, and certainly their job relevant skills. So the one area where it does become a little bit more critical is if you are using any of the vocational tasters, because there is an expectation that anybody involved in those, at least involved in assessing those units, would have a background in that sector. So they would normally be expected to be occupationally competent in that arena. But obviously, in terms of the generic units, there wouldn't necessarily need to be sector specific experience.
Okay, and certainly when they've been putting through, obviously, their trainers and their CVs, and our QA people have been looking at that and approving accordingly. So there's one other question around about, and I think we touched on it before, with assessment and the diversity of assessment. Somebody asked about professional discussions. I think there's a whole broad suite of different assessment methodologies, but maybe that's something you can touch on a little bit more in what you've seen in the UK.
Yes, I mean, the professional discussions can form part of the mix, if you like, here, in the sense that sometimes, and I guess what they can be useful for, particularly with these units, are instances where you're perhaps needing to see a what if, or to explore a what if scenario with a learner. I mean, we tend to use the term professional discussion usually in relation to higher level qualifications, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, in the sense that there could well be a discussion, or you could well have an assessor and candidate discussion about I'm just trying to think of an example off the top of my head from this suite, but certainly there'll be instances where that could be useful in terms of fulfilling some of the assessment criteria, in the sense that they could have an activity that's met, that you may, particularly if it's an activity where they wouldn't encounter that in an everyday environment, but it's something where through a professional discussion you could tease out knowledge and understanding of an area, or allow them to explain what they would do if they were in a scenario. So they certainly can be used as part of this. They're not, there isn't a requirement to use professional discussion. I mean, in the same way there isn't a requirement to use any one single type of evidence gathering here, but they certainly are potentially useful to cover scenarios where you haven't necessarily got a naturally occurring example of where something has actually taken place, but they can certainly be used as part of this. They could be useful equally, because they're quite relatively easy in the current climate to do those remotely as well, in the sense that if you haven't physically got into the same room, there's absolutely no reason why those couldn't be done through Teams or another platform.
Paul, do you think there's an opportunity to review example work? Is that kind of thing that's happened in the UK? Is there any kind of high-level moderation of work that could potentially be shared with our group, so they have an understanding of what the outcomes and the production is?
We've done a bit of that, and I guess we've tacitly done that to some extent through the smart screen examples, in the sense that we've tried to sort of, and we've done it a little bit in an indirect way, because I think what we're always a little bit nervous about with providing examples is that becomes the blueprint everybody copies, rather than necessarily this is one way you could. So we've always, and I'm always quite careful about using the term example rather than exemplar, for that reason, in the sense that this is one way you could do it, and it's about illustrating that this is, I guess, within the realms of what would be okay in terms of complexity and demand, rather than it's got to look exactly like this. So it can be useful. I mean, we've done that a little bit in the past, and I guess that's where we've tried to do it a little bit through the smart screen example, is try to provide some examples. The other thing I guess we've done through that unit pack is try to give some examples of activities as well that may help also for that, from that perspective. I guess we're always open to the idea of actually getting, and to some extent, some of that internal standardization piece can sometimes be about assessors coming together to compare notes in terms of particularly where they are delivering quite a similar type of program, to come together and sort of share examples of what they've seen themselves through evidence, and particularly if there's any sort of niggling doubts about, is that really what we will look, is that really good enough, or is that enough, then it can help often tease that out.
I think something which we're discussing is this idea of a marking scheme, which has been asked from Tam Keen.
Yeah.
But as I've explained, this is a kind of a pass or referral type of approach,
yeah.
whether it's about, it's 100% or zero.
Yeah.
And my view would be that perhaps the marking scheme, if you want to call it a marking scheme, is just the unit logbook elements, which would probably indicate, whether this person has passed or not and achieved the outcomes. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's effectively the case, in the sense that if you like, the assessment criteria are the mark scheme. But again, as you say, I guess that is quite an important point. Effectively, the pass mark is 100%, in the sense that you've got to have evidence of everything there. So it is about them demonstrating, and because it's not a qualification you fail, in the sense that you keep going until you've got the evidence. So it is about, obviously, not it's kind of pass or not passed yet, if you like, rather than failed. So in the sense, it's referring back, and you may well have instances. The other thing to think about is sometimes is that you may well have activities that hit the criteria for more than one learning outcome, or they might indeed hit the criteria for more than one unit. So there can be instances where you may well be able to take an activity and cross match that across, or use it to evidence more than one unit or set of criteria.
Thanks, Paul. At this point, my colleagues James and George will have to take over, but thank you very much indeed for helping us. George, James, could you look to see if there's any other questions?
Yes. So what I can see is that there's a question regarding visiting centres for moderation. From my understanding, we will be doing that. We will be visiting centres where it's possible physically, but also we'll be undertaking some remote meetings as well. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean that's generally been the pattern across Sitting Girls, and actually across all qualifications, is that we've kind of, to some extent, obviously COVID has put to some extent some constraints on doing face-to-face visits and obviously monitoring activity of this sort. It has been going ahead remotely, and I guess what the future will start to look like is more of a mixed bag, and actually even pre-COVID there was a kind of mixed bag of it. Sometimes monitoring would take place remotely, sometimes it would be face to face. So there is always a little bit of a mixed economy. I guess in the future we will probably and it's probably a pattern of most things, in the sense that there will generally be a little bit more focus on remote, particularly because if you've got evidence in electronic form, it's a lot easier to review that without somebody having to be physically on site to look at that. But equally, I guess we're always very conscious that part of that external verification role is also about obviously understanding your systems and your processes, as well as the actual product evidence. So it can be important to obviously put some of that into context, and sometimes, not always, sometimes that can only really come about through face-to-face.
Very good. We've got a question about potential occupations after completing the course. Over to you, Paul.
I mean, I guess the thing about this suite is it's not, and it's quite deliberately not trying to, and I guess the one slight exception of the vocational tasters, but for the most part, this suite really is about equipping learners with the capabilities for whatever career path they might be going down. So it's not occupationally specific or job role specific, this, in the sense that what it's providing them with, or is helping to support learners with, is a whole series of capabilities around their own either their personal social skills, but also their ability to apply for or sustain themselves in work of any description. So it is in itself not going to lead to any particular job, but what it will do is almost whatever job you might be going after, or whatever career path you might be following, the expectation is that it will help with some of those generic job. I mean, we sometimes refer to them as soft skills. I think sometimes that isn't always a helpful term because it makes them seem trivial and unimportant. But some of those things that enable people to succeed in work, whatever type of work they might be going for. I guess sometimes I'm just seeing Anne-Marie's question, and I guess it's kind of relevant in the sense of around size of learning. One of the things about this suite is obviously you can do as little or as much of it as you need to, in the sense that we've got all of those different stop-off points. In the sense the smallest stop-off point is after 2 credits, so that would effectively be 20 hours worth of learning, but there are kind of larger qualifications that would be sort of 60, they're 100 hours, kind of 150 hours, or even bigger than that. So the idea is that you can kind of do as much activity or do as many units as you have the space to do, or is it appropriate for the learner to do. But that is where it can be useful to think about ways in which one single holistic activity could provide evidence for several units at once, because often that can make the evidence gathering process, but also it can make the learning experience more holistic and more relevant, in the sense that you may well be activities that may well overlap in terms of how they are appropriate to learn about, because obviously the process of producing a CV might be relevant for in some settings, but equally the process of preparing for an interview may well follow on naturally from that, and you may well do that as one sort of cycle of work, rather than necessarily 2 things that you would do entirely in isolation from one or the other. But
yeah. George, do you have any more questions? Because I think that's it from my side.
Sceeny. I mean, obviously, sorry, James.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say, right, I think we've got some more questions that are just coming through now. So the difference between the entry 1 and the level 1. Yeah, if you could just clarify that, please, Paul.
I'll do that one first. I'll do that one first, if you like. I mean, there is, I mean, the way that the qualification levels work is that you have entry level is the kind of bottom rung of the ladder in terms of, and our sort of, these levels go obviously used throughout the qualification system in the UK. Entry 1 is the kind of bottom rung of the ladder, and then entry 2, then entry 3, and then the next level up from that is level 1. This employability suite actually kicks in from entry 2 upwards. So entry 2 is the sort of lowest level within the 5546 suite of qualifications, but then there are also units and qualifications at entry 3, level 1 and level 2. Didn't really delve into this here, but what you do also have within this, within the rules of combination for these qualifications, is the ability to access a small number of units from either the level immediately above or the level immediately below the suite. I mean, not everybody does that, because often it can be easier not to, or safer not to go there. But sometimes it can be appropriate where learners have a different range of experiences or are more accomplished in some areas than others, to recognise that at a higher level. In terms of the recognition of this, those may be questions for colleagues based in the region in terms of being able to answer that more detail. I suppose the crucial thing around this qualification is that it won't in itself ever get anybody into any particular job, but it may well be a prerequisite in terms of getting them through the door in terms of understanding and being able to demonstrate that they've got a range of job ready capabilities. So yeah, I mean, some of those detailed questions around obviously how the Ministry of Labour is planning to use the qualification, and obviously our attitude of the private sector, and obviously what might be useful to use. I guess the answer to all of those may well depend on circumstance, but obviously this part of the intention behind this was always to support that process of helping individuals either into work or to succeed and progress when they're in work. But certainly for job seeking, it would be helping in terms of trying to get some of those things that would help in terms of being able to be ready for work, but also to be able to sort of operate successfully in a work environment. In
absolutely, and I think, Paul, I think you've addressed the main motivation of the Ministry of Labour in Bahrain, which is obviously predominantly to assist and support the learners into work. We have a question which relates to citing examples of other places where employability skills has assisted people in gaining employment, and if there's any examples of market studies that have been undertaken. Are there any such examples?
I suppose there are examples in the sense of there are, and I guess the bit that's always difficult to unpack a little bit here is how much is that about the learning that's taking place versus how much is this about the qualification per se. I mean, the qualification is a means of recognising where that learning and that achievement has taken place. So it's a way of actually, and I suppose it's back to a little bit of that question a second ago, in the sense that having an employability skills qualification won't in itself get you in. Well, it's only as good as in the sense that it represents having done that learning, but actually it's that learning and actually having, I suppose, having done a unit in interview skills won't get you a job, but it may well help you with the capabilities when you go for a real interview. So in that sense, it is about obviously building those capabilities and enabling learners potentially to be able to get either into work or to succeed in work. And I guess it's probably useful to see it in those terms, in the sense that it's providing a platform or providing an ability to acquire some of those skills and knowledge and understanding.
Excellent. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the WhatsApp group at the moment.
As we said, obviously people are happy to, I mean, if there are further questions that kind of come to mind in the sort of coming days, obviously I'm happy to sort of pick those up separately. I think plan was to sort of circulate a kind of a Q&A after this session anyway, so we can kind of add to that if more questions come through in the meantime.
No, absolutely, and of course, they can reach out to us via the WhatsApp group or via George. Okay, I think that that's about it from us, Paul. Thank you for the time, and thank you for your explanations. I think it's provided great clarity for everyone. And of course, as we do receive questions over the next few days, we will forward them to you, and we can definitely work on a Q&A which we can circulate to everyone. So thank you from us, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining. And of course, we will be in touch very soon.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, everybody, thanks